I'm honored today to have on my podcast one of my favorite therapists, Sarah Dozange. Sarah is a psychotherapist who specializes in treatment of eating disorders and the writer of the book, I Can't Stop Eating, How to Break Free from the Cycle of Binging. She is also the owner of the famous YouTube channel, The Binge Eating Therapist, and the co-host of Life After Diets podcast. Welcome, Sarah. It's an honor to have you on my podcast.
Hi, Kiralis. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here.
Great. Um, I want to begin this discussion with the famous concept of Carl Jung when he talked about the concept of the wounded healers.
Hmm.
I see this famous pattern or archetype in so many inspirational lives, such yours. Uh, how this concept resonates with you? Tell us more about your own story with binge eating and recovery.
Yeah, thank you. I think when you go through struggles and pain in life, there is, in some of us anyway, a desire to make some meaning out of that. Because if I had just recovered from binge eating and then just carried on doing exactly what I was doing, it kind of might have felt like, well, what was that for? So I think sometimes the wounded healer is about finding meaning. And sometimes it's to continue our own healing journey because I'm always learning from my clients and the work that I do as well. And recovering from an eating disorder often isn't a place that you just arrive at. And now I no longer do this behavior and I feel completely, quote unquote, normal around food.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I struggled with binge eating and bulimia for 10 years. And yeah, I always said to myself when I was in it that if I recovered, I would find a way to help other people recover as well. And then I kind of had to make good on my promise when I found my way out. Um, so my binging didn't start until my mid 20s. A lot of people I work with, it often starts earlier. It can start in childhood sometimes for self-soothing, or sometimes when people start dieting is a very common one as well. With mine, I think mine was hormonally triggered partially. So
Hmm.
I had a pituitary tumor on the brain, which I didn't know that I had, but it'd thrown all my hormones out and it just really dysregulated my appetite. But because I was fighting with my appetite, it kept turning into binging. I was always trying to eat less, and that was making me binge more. Plus, I had all the classic black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking. I think that's the biggest predictor of something like binge eating. So it was a bit of a perfect storm, I think, from biology and a psychology perspective for me.
Hmm. Okay. On which moment exactly did you start to have the idea of wanting to become a therapist, helping others
Yeah.
suffering? Because I really loved the story of Marshall Lennon. Uh, when she made she writes in her memoirs that she took an oath on herself to get herself out of hell, and when she does that, to return again to hell and help others. So yeah, tell me more details if you can.
Yeah. Mine was a little different because I started training to be a therapist while I still was very much in my eating disorder.
Mm,
So when I started training to be a therapist, at that time, I didn't think I would necessarily be working with eating disorders. It wasn't like I recovered and then thought, right, now I'm going to be a therapist. I was in it. At the time when I had my eating disorder, I was actually a police officer. And because of my health problems, I'd gone into an office based role. So I wasn't out on the streets anymore. And actually, a friend came to visit me with her dog, and we took the dog out for a walk, and the dog stopped to do what dogs do. And as she's cleaning up after the dog, I'm just standing there waiting. And I look up, and there's this big sign that says Metanoia Counseling and Psychotherapy Center. And I'd never noticed this building. This building was just around the corner from where I lived, and I'd never seen it and had this big dragon. And I remember it just caught my eye. And then later on, I think maybe the next day, it was called metanoia, and I'd never heard this word before. I don't know why, but I Googled the building and I saw that they were doing an evening class in basic counseling skills. Well, at this time, I was
mm,
doing a lot of work in the prisons with offenders and getting them ready for their release and working with probation. So I thought that actually, this could be very helpful for my job. I never thought it was going to be the start of a career change. So then I go to this evening class because I also thought it would get me out of the house. All I was doing was working and then coming home and binging. Like I felt like I'd really withdrawn. And when I did that course and I met the people on the course and I just started learning about counseling, it lit something in me. And it really, I think becoming a therapist was a huge part of my recovery because it gave me some meaning. And also, here in the UK, to become a therapist, you have to be in therapy yourself. So then I had to go into therapy, whereas before I'd go for a bit, but then I didn't feel like the therapist knew anything about binge eating or couldn't help me, and then I would leave. But because I had to go in for so long, I think that was enormously helpful in my recovery. Yeah. So it wasn't quite that I got out of hell and returned. I was in hell and I kind of thought I'm just going to find some other people who are struggling and see if I can make some meaning out of that. And even because as I became was qualifying as a therapist and I was recovering, I went into this work quite quickly, and that was a bit nerve-wracking because I hadn't been recovered very long when I started working with it. And so there was a lot of conversations to be had in supervision about whether it was okay for me to work with other people this early on. Could it be triggering for me? But I loved the work and I really felt like I could be useful. And that was just very motivating to kind of niche down even more.
Beautiful story. It's not a coincidence that the word metanoia was on that building because it's the Greek word for repentance. It
Yes.
means to get outside of your mind and to observe your own thoughts and what is driving your behaviors.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I learned that afterwards, but at the time I'd never heard the word. But yes, I forgot it was a Greek word. But yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So before we can speak about the topic, we must first diagnose or give it a definition.
hmm
Uh, so what is binge eating? Is it an addiction? Is it a compulsion, disorder? What is it exactly? How can we
hmm
define it or diagnose it?
Well, because if we're talking about diagnosis, we're talking about then the clinical definition of binge eating. So I go for the clinical definition, I go by the DSM-5. Do you use the DSM-5 where you are?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have.
Yeah. So they clinically define a binge as eating an amount of food that is definitely larger than most people would eat in similar circumstances in a discrete window of time. So the example given is around 2 hours, but that's quite flexible. And it has to be accompanied by a sense of a loss of control. So it's still very subjective, even though it's a clinical definition. When it comes to mental health and behaviors, often there is a lot of subjectivity. So when they're saying an amount of food definitely larger than most people would eat in similar circumstances, I sometimes use the example, if people go on a holiday and it's all inclusive, it's like a massive buffet of food. And especially the first few days, people might eat a lot of food and feel quite uncomfortable. But that's
Mhm.
something that a lot of people would do that might look very different if you did the same thing at home on a Tuesday evening. So the circumstances do matter, which is why they haven't defined the exact amount of food. So that's the clinical definition of a binge. And then for it to be binge eating disorder, that has to happen at least once a week for 3 months. So there's a frequency. If people are doing it once or twice a month, it's not binge eating disorder. You could still say that that was an episode of binge eating, but it's not the clinical definition for an eating disorder. And then there's smaller sub-criteria like feeling a lot of guilt, shame, disgust about eating when uncomfortably full, eating faster than normal, secretive eating, all these other little subsections which add evidence to it being an eating disorder. There has to be marked distress for it to be an eating disorder. So sometimes people want to diagnose people in their lives with binge eating disorder, but somebody might be having binges, but if they don't care about it and they're fine with that behavior, it doesn't meet the criteria for an eating disorder.
Hmm.
So those are the main criteria. But when I'm working with binge eating is a phrase that isn't just a clinical phrase. We use it in everyday language. Like addiction. There's more clinical ways of looking at addiction, and then there's more just everyday language. So I don't tend to get too tied up on diagnosis because I'm a private therapist. I don't have to officially diagnose anybody. You know, I'm not working for an insurance company or the National Health Service. So I'm happy to go with however the client wants to define it. If they want to say that they're calling it binge eating or they're calling it an eating disorder or they're calling it disordered eating, I don't mind because it's just language at the end of the day to try and understand an experience.
Okay, so can we define it as an addiction? Is addiction applies to it?
Well, they've taken the word addiction out of the DSM-5 because
Hmm.
it's too hard to define. Addiction's too hard to define. So they don't even say alcohol addiction anymore. So addiction is no longer a clinical word because of the different ways we use it. We can't agree on a definition. So I don't tend to use the word addiction. If somebody uses the word addiction, I'm not going to say to them, no, it's not an addiction. Don't call it an addiction. It's not an addiction. Call it whatever you need to call it. I don't use the word addiction because I think with the word addiction, it's like, okay, we're calling it an addiction. What's the solution? And then people fall into the trap. Oh, the solution is some kind of abstinence. You know, we have to give up sugar or we have to give up flour. We have to do that. And for a very small percentage of people, that works. But for a lot of people, trying to do that makes their binge eating even worse. It did for me. I went to Overeaters Anonymous for 7 months and my binging was worse than ever. And I was trying really, really hard to give up sugar. And I didn't realize because of the restrictive element of that, that was triggering more binges. So I just felt even more shame. I just felt even more like a failure.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't like to use the label addiction or call someone an addict. I think people are more complex
Mm.
than we can restrain them into a specific label or specific diagnosis. Yeah. Since we talked about the restriction uh, and deprivation, all of that, uh, Oscar Wilde once said, I would quote him, uh, that the only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it, resist it, and your soul grows sick with longing for the things that it has forbidden to itself, with desire for what its monstrous laws have made monstrous and unlawful. It seems that human beings are wired to desire the forbidden, like even religiously speaking, the story of Adam and Eve and the forbidden fruit, like despite every other healthy fruit was available to them, still they had craving for that thing that was forbidden. I would like to hear more from you about this idea and how it corresponds to dealing with eating disorders in general.
Yeah. Because most people would agree that if someone had an alcohol or a drug addiction, that the idea would be to figure out how to give that up most of the time. I think with food, where it gets difficult is because it's so tied in with survival. You know, our drive to eat, our appetite is so primal. It's the classic, you know, we can survive without alcohol, we can't survive without food. So I do agree with the idea of what you resist persists. So I think the important part is about figuring out how to not turn it into a battle with yourself. Because if you're fighting with yourself about it, you are both sides of that fight. So you cannot win it. Part of you is always going to lose. And the more split you become to fight with yourself, the harder it is to get to any place where it feels like you're making a free choice. Because if you're having binges where you're feeling out of control around food, yes, there is going to be a place for figuring out how to say no, but it's hard to work, I think, on the no until you can say a free yes. So if there's
Mhm.
always guilt and shame around saying yes, because you always think you shouldn't, you always think you shouldn't, then when you're trying to work on the no's always going to feel restrictive. So this is why moving out the black and white all or nothing thinking is so important, and it's also why it's so challenging because the mind wants to go, well, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to say yes? Am I supposed to say no? Like, what is the right thing to do? And we want to make both of those feel freer, but until it's allowed to say no, it's often going to feel restrictive. It's going to trigger the rebel or the part of you that is frightened of scarcity, which is so primal in our brains, the idea of food being scarce. that it can really take us over. So we really want to undo the moralization of good and bad. It's not bad to binge. A lot of people feel like it's harming them. And of course, and it causes pain, and it's not something that people want to be doing, but it's not morally bad. But a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people feel like the worst person in the world when they binge or when they're compulsively eating. They feel like it
Yeah.
says something really about who they are, you know?
Yeah, I really love the idea from the 12 steps programs that it's a disease, not a moral failure.
Mm, yeah. But the 12-step programs would say, you know, it's something that you have like for life. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the piece that it could be true for some people, but I think going in, you'll go to an OA meeting and maybe somebody who hasn't binged for 10 years will still introduce themselves as, "Hi, I'm Sarah, I'm a compulsive eater." And so there's this
Mm.
belief that's instilled that you cannot, there is a part of you that cannot be trusted because it's diseased, but it cannot be trusted. And don't get me wrong, if anybody's done this program and it's really working for them and has made them feel freer, great. Like, I
Hmm.
just want people to feel free. I don't
Yeah,
feel like this is the only way.
we don't have to agree to everything. We just take what works for us from different treatment programs. Uh, okay, I want to move to a very famous question that uh, many people struggle with. If someone would ask you why diets don't work, I see a lot of body transformations all over the social media. Why won't that work for me? How would you answer such a question?
Yeah. I think this idea that because it's possible for someone else, that it should be possible for you is problematic. So, one, we don't know what's going on in anyone else's life. I have worked with a lot of health coaches, you know, people who are teaching this way of eating, this very clean way of eating publicly, and secretly they're binging and then they're coming to therapy to try and work on their binging. But they're
Wow.
presenting, when you would look at them, you would look at them and think like, you know, wow, they're in a slim body, they've got the physique that I want and all of that. And the binging can still be going on. Bodybuilding is one of the sports, I guess, when people do that, that they are the most at risk of binging. Everyone in the bodybuilding world is very aware of binging and how it shows up and how it feels and all of that. Um, so there's that piece. Just because somebody looks a certain way, we don't know if there's like problematic or disordered things going on. But let's say there isn't. Right? Let's say somebody can just. I tend to find that the people who are in that fitness space that have those physiques and seem to be, again, we don't know, but seem to be a healthy mindset or whatever around food. One, I think it often becomes like an identity. It's who they are. So I'm somebody who now I do yoga every day. And sometimes people will hear that and they'll go, "Gosh, you're so disciplined. You do yoga every day, this, that, the other." And that always feels like I feel like a fraud when people say that to me because that's just who I am. It feels such a part of my identity that it would feel weird not to do it. So it's not like it takes some kind of superhuman strength or willpower, which is one piece of it. I think biologically we're different as well. I think some brains are much more vulnerable to the binge response when they eat in an energy deficit. And that could
Hmm.
be, I think there's highly likely that there is a transgenerational genetic link. So it could be if your ancestors just a couple of steps away went through famine, that can be passed down genetically, that you are more reactive to there not being enough food. Because the binge is actually a survival drive. It's kind of gone awry in our culture today because we have food everywhere, but because it's this primal old part of the brain where it comes from. And that's also why when it hits that urge to binge, anyone who's experienced it can attest, it feels like life or death. In that moment, it feels like nothing else matters but to have the food. And it doesn't matter what you said to yourself earlier. And then afterwards, you've eaten, you've binged, you think like, what, why did I do that again? And then you just promise to yourself, you feel terrible about it. And then you make promises that you're not going to do it again. I think that's one of the reasons why it's so confusing and people feel like it's not even themselves when it gets really bad.
Hmm. So, if you would work with someone who is, uh, let's use a neutral terminology, in a larger body. Okay, but he really has he really has this very strong desire to lose weight, uh, given the cultural tradition and all of that. Can we can our plan or strategy of treatment be something like that? We will first treat his problem with food, treat his binge eating, then we can later work on weight loss. Or if someone has binge eating, he is like forever can't go on a diet and lose weight.
Mhm.
Because as someone who works as a nutritionist and someone who works to help people lose their weight, I feel like many people really want to lose weight. I can't just to tell them you will
Mhm.
never lose weight.
Yeah. Can I ask it the other way around then? If I can ask you the question, have you worked with anybody who has recovered from binge eating and then you've worked with them to lose weight and they have intentionally lost weight?
And no, they can't lose weight while they have binge eating.
No, but let's say they did. They had binge eating
Hmm.
and then that's much better now. And have you ever seen that where somebody's got their binge eating under control first and then been able to lose weight?
Not really. I didn't.
So I don't think it's as simple as like,
But
I'm
I
not going to
don't.
say,
But I
yeah,
don't have a lot of clinical experience yet, so I
okay.
can't give the right answer to it.
Yeah, yeah.
From my own history, I know that uh, my own brother, struggled with food, and he tried many diets to lose weight, but they all failed. And as I sent you in the email, he finally uh, got into depression because all of that and all of the bullying that he was suffering in his childhood in school, and he committed suicide. So I, I can testify that yeah, diets don't work. There's
Hmm.
a huge problem in diets, but
Hmm.
also I can't get this idea of losing weight outside of my
Yeah,
mind because
yeah. And I don't say to people, "Oh, you can never lose weight," because I don't know what's going to be possible for someone. I think one, people come to me because they want to stop binging. I don't coach people then how to lose weight afterwards. So if somebody recovers from binge eating, we often stop working together at that point. So I wouldn't necessarily know. There are people who, when as they're recovering from binge eating, lose weight, but that desire to lose weight is going to be strong for most, if not all, binge eaters. It's going to be there. And sometimes for very legitimate reasons. It's not all to do with diet culture, although that plays a part for a lot of people. So the work and the focus that I'm often looking at with clients is how do we manage this desire to lose weight so that it doesn't derail your recovery? Because we get people to look at when they're more focused on weight loss, what happens? So, in order for recovery, for most people with binge eating, the turning point that I tend to see is when the recovery itself, the not binging, the being mentally free, the being able to make more decisions that feel like really support your health mentally, emotionally, and physically, when that becomes more important than weight loss, that's when people really see changes. And so for me, when I recovered from binge eating, I did lose some weight. My weight did come down. But the times it came down was only when I was really not that focused on it. Because the problem is
mm,
for a lot of people, when it's been years and years of this hyper focus on weight loss, is that the minute they start focusing on it, their thinking goes wonky. So for me, what classic one would be I wouldn't binge for a few weeks, and then I would notice that my weight was starting to come down a bit. And then the minute I noticed, I started overthinking my food decisions because now I was like, oh, this is kind of nice and I want this to carry on. So then I start questioning my food decisions about whether they're going to bring me towards or away from weight loss. And then that seemed to trigger binging again. So in my own personal experience, I really had to let go of that. It had to be okay. It didn't mean that I didn't still want to lose weight, but I had to accept that that couldn't be a priority. And then I lost some weight. But I can't say the same for everybody because I think some people, it could be that when the brain, and we're talking the primal brain here, so it doesn't have language, you can't just reassure it and say, hey, it's okay, don't
Exactly.
worry about it, you don't need to react like this. I think for some people, when the primal brain recognizes weight's being lost, it might increase appetite or it might trigger a response. So whether that can be undone in some people, I don't know. But again, I think it's on such a case by case basis. Because I had someone
Mm.
write to me, they said, why don't you talk about your weight loss more? Because I think it would be reassuring to people. I don't want to use my story to reassure people when I don't know what's possible for others. I just don't know. So I think it's a really, really good question. I'm not going to be able to give a very satisfying answer. I think for some people, yes, it may be possible to even directly focus on weight loss. And for some people, it will just trigger that old thinking. And for some people, it might trigger a biological response that then creates like a conflict in them again around food. So someone described it to me once as a bit like, you know, the legend or the myth of Medusa. You know, you can't
Yeah.
look at her because if you look at her like that, it's game over. It can almost be a bit like that with weight loss. Just don't look at it. You know, focus on your decisions that are trying to self-care and taking care of yourself around food. And for some people, that might result in weight loss. And for some people, it might not. And that, I think, is what makes recovery from something like binge eating so challenging. If someone comes to therapy because they want to stop having panic attacks, what's the downside? No downside. Maybe you'll stop having panic attacks if you do the therapy. But with something like binge eating recovery, when for a lot of people, like all they've wanted, maybe for years, they're desperate for the weight loss and they're being told do recovery, but it might mean that you can't lose weight. Straight away, like there's a conflict there. And I think that it's such a block to recovery for people. And it's such a challenge. And it's easy for me, you know, I'm not in a larger body to sit here and go, oh, everyone should just let go of weight loss. I get it. It's not that straightforward. But it really is such a individual journey on trying to figure out what's possible, understanding your physiological and your psychological kind of kickbacks, if you like, when you're focusing or thinking about or doing anything to promote weight loss.
Okay, I believe it's every specific person treatment must be tailored to his own conditions, and yeah, so we can't generalize any treatment option. But I want to speak more about the root cause of the desire to lose weight.
Mm.
We need to speak about body image and attraction criteria, especially in females these days. There's a beautiful chapter from the work of C.S. Lewis that speaks about how attraction and sexual taste is shaped from time to time. So in his book, Screwtape Letters, he says these words. I don't know if you know this book or not, but he is like, in a funny way, in this book, there is an older devil speaking with a younger devil to teach him how to seduce his clients.
Okay.
It's a very funny way, but I want to send you this page. I don't know if I can
Hmm.
send it on this chat, and we can read it and analyze it together, because I believe there's a lot of wisdom in this passage.
Hmm. Well, I like C.S. Lewis. I don't know if you've ever heard me share my favorite quote is actually a C.S. Lewis one. And it's the one that goes, isn't it funny how day by day nothing changes, but then you look back and everything's different?
Okay. It is a business of these great masters to produce in every age a general misdirection of what may be called sexual tastes. This they do by working through the small circle of popular arts, dressmakers, actresses, and advertisers who determine the fashionable type. The aim is to guide each sex away from those members of the other with whom a spiritually helpful, happy, and fertile marriages are most likely. Thus, we have now for many centuries triumphed over nature to the extent of making certain secondary characteristics of the male, such as a beard, disagreeable to nearly all females. of course, this is not happening right now, but in the age of C.S. Lewis, the beard was disagreeable to females. And there is more in that than you might suppose. As regards to the male taste, have varied a good deal. At one time, we have directed it to the status quo and the aristocratic type of beauty, mixing men's vanity with their desires and encouraging the race to breed chiefly from the most arrogant and the prodigal women. At another, we have selected an exaggeratedly feminine type, faint and languishing, so that folly and the cowardice and all the general falseness and littleness of mind which go with them shall be at a premium. At present, we are on the opposite task. Then this next part is really the point. He says, the age of jazz has succeeded the age of the waltz, and now we teach men to like women whose bodies are scarcely distinguishable from those of boys, since this is a kind of beauty even more transitory than most. We thus aggravate the female's chronic horror of growing old with many excellent results, and render her less willing and less able to bear its children. And that is not all. We have engineered a great increase in the license which society allows to the representation of the apparent nude, not the real one, in art and its exhibition on the stage, on the bathing beach. It's all fake, of course. The figures in the popular art are falsely drawn. The real women in bathing suits or tights are actually benched in and propped up to make them appear firmer and more slender and more boyish than nature allows a full-grown woman to be. Yet, at the same time, the modern world is taught to believe that it is being frank and healthy and getting back to nature. As a result, we are more and more directing the desires of men to something which does not exist, making the rule of the eye in sexuality more and more important, and at the same time making its demands more and more impossible.
What year was this written? Do you know?
I think in the I can Google it. I think it's in the 50s or 60s.
Okay, yeah.
Screw tape, letters, date.
Yeah, just curious.
In the 40s.
In the 40s, okay. That's interesting. I didn't know that the boyish type was the boyish figure, as they describe it, was big in the 40s. There you go.
Yeah. Okay, I would love to hear what do you think of this right now?
Well, nothing changes, does it? You think about that now in the age of information and social media and all the images that we're bombarded with, how different that would have been in the 40s. Yet it's the same pattern. The small group of influentials, casting this out. The people who I work with who are the most affected by really bad body image, that came from someone close to them, what they said. Not normally something they heard or saw in the magazine. Now, I'm not saying that the person close to them, of course, we're all influenced by culture, but when someone close to us makes a comment about our bodies, how they should or shouldn't be, that holds so much weight because as children, we trust the adults around us, the family members. And that's where it really, really takes a hold. It's not normally, I opened up a magazine and I read this article about bodies being a certain way and that triggered off, the start of my body image problems. It's like, no, it's what those close. It's what we're saying to and around little ears. And I also think the younger that happens, the more significant. I was very fortunate, and I think this really benefited me in my recovery. I grew up in a household where appearance wasn't highly valued.
Okay.
My parents didn't really speak about it. They didn't comment much on other people's opinion. They might have commented if someone had gained a very noticeable amount of weight or lost a very noticeable amount of weight, they might make a comment and then it would pass. It's not like they would spend half an hour talking about it or dissecting it, but it wasn't that big. So whilst I've been influenced by culture, the people who were most important in shaping how I felt about my body, they did a good job without even realizing it. But many people are not as fortunate.
I believe that from a very young age, we are exposed nowadays even if we just speak about social media, but I think we also need to speak about the rise of the porn industry and how it affected the criteria of beauty. The hideous thing about exposure to such things in an early age, that it's kind of form our shapes our males sexual and also females in some way sexual tastes in a way that is irreversible. I believe it's irreversible because in this early age the brain is highly neuroplastic, and this neuroplasticity is lost afterwards. So we are dealing with a problem that how can we change a culture such this culture we are living in? How can you tell someone in a larger body to just ignore all the comments he receives every day in the bus or in the streets or in his workplace? What is the solution to that? I really don't have a solution.
No, but I would just comment that I've had a few clients in larger bodies who have decided to date, and they've been pleasantly surprised at how many prospective partners find them attractive. So it can sound a bit like a sweeping statement. I think, yes, culturally we're very much influenced by all the things that you mentioned into preferring a certain body type. And I think for a lot of people as well, there are just innate attractions to different body types from that. It doesn't sweep everybody the same way. We're far more diverse than that. But they're less likely to talk about their attraction. Let's say somebody finds larger bodies much more attractive than slim bodies. They're less likely to talk about that. They're less likely to be super vocal about that. So the rest of us wouldn't know. We don't know what people's preferences are necessarily. So I don't think it's quite as hopeless, because you describe quite a bleak. I do think, because we know now that kids are getting exposed to pornography earlier and earlier, and it is massively, even something like body hair, for example, and what's considered normal compared to what you would see in the porn industry is having an effect for sure. But I still think, yeah, 'cause, I mean, even within the porn industry, there's a fair bit of diversity for people who are interested in it.
If someone wants to be treated from his problem with body image, how do you handle such a case in your treatment? What is the best approach to heal someone from body image problems?
Yeah. I think, first of all, can the person recognize that the thing that's causing them the most distress is how they're thinking and feeling about their body rather than their body? And I'm talking about for body image distress, because that's different to maybe somebody gaining weight and feeling uncomfortable with weight gain. It shows up. It just shows up differently, because it could be for them, actually their body image was kind of okay, and then they gained some weight and they felt uncomfortable with the weight gain and they have a difficult image with their body, compared to somebody who, when they were 9 years old, felt that their body was too big. They look back at photographs now and they can see that their body wasn't, but at the time they felt that. So they have carried that feeling in their body no matter what happens to their body. And there's a difference between going, oh, I don't feel comfortable in my body, I don't really like my body, and catching sight of yourself and being filled with fear, terror, disgust. I mean, that's what we're talking about at the real high end of body image struggles. So we talk about it as like flooding. The whole body just gets flooded with fear, dread, panic when they catch sight of themselves, when they feel their body in a certain way. So we need to be able to recognize. So I work with clients on recognizing that they are in what we call a flood. So we might think of different, sometimes I use it as levels. So like level 5 body image reaction is a flood, and a level 1 is like a moment of discomfort. So when we are in like that fear or that terror, being able to ground ourselves and understand what's going on Because the other thing as well, for many people, body image fluctuates. So sometimes it's worse, sometimes it's not bad, maybe sometimes it's even good. So understanding the fluctuations, which is very different to somebody who always has a terrible, terrible experience of their body. So making some sense of it, but also in the moment, like finding different tools and techniques to be able to feel safe in your body. And so that's going to be things like recognizing what level body image reaction am I having. The minute you say I'm having a body image reaction, instead of what you were saying before, which is, oh my goodness, my body is XYZ, it's too big, it's this, it's this, it's this. Because then you think the reason why you're having this feeling is because your body is what's wrong. So it's like, is there a switch to go, actually, it's my mental and emotional reaction that's causing me the problem? Because having a body can be uncomfortable. So it doesn't mean that you get to a place where you love having a body. Having bodies is a self-conscious thing. It can be physically uncomfortable. They can be visually uncomfortable to us sometimes. So again, like it's a hard question to answer really broadly because it's going to depend how it's showing up in that particular person. But finding ways to talk yourself down in the moment, because the other thing that will happen is if you have a flood, like a level 5 reaction, your brain's going to be panicking about how you need to change your body. So a lot of people would be like, I have to lose weight. It might be for someone else. I need to look at surgery because this is wrong or that is wrong. And it's sometimes in the work I'll do, we make a commitment that I am not going to make any decisions about changing my body when I'm in a level 5. So I recognize it. I'm thinking I need to do something about it. But because I know I'm in a level 5, it's like I need to wait until I feel calm and then I'll make a decision. Because then you can make an actual decision. If you're making a decision from panic and fear, it's not really a decision, it's just a reaction.
Yeah, it makes sense. Uh, how does CBT approach works with this? I've read the book that Dr. Christopher Fairburn has wrote, and I really love this idea about that there is the core psychopathology in eating disorders is using his own language as over-evaluation of shape and body weight. It's as if that the person is getting his sense of value almost like a 95% from his weight and body image and 5% from other domains in life. So does it's changing that also helps helps dealing with body image problems? Or is it more emotional kind of problem?
Yeah. Well, those things are both. So this is the kind of work that I love doing with clients because it's thinking about what is meaningful in your life? What is it you want to be putting your mental and emotional energy into if it's not going into your body? Because actually, if eating disorder and body image work is only focusing on food and body, it kind of keeps the energy focused on the problem. And so, like in my life, becoming a therapist and doing the training, it gave me this sense of purpose and something that I could get a sense of self from that wasn't this because it kind of had turned into my identity. This is who I am. I'm just this person who is completely out of control around food and who's just a constant failure because she never sticks to anything she says she's going to do. And it was really like just destroying my sense of self. So I think often, yes, we do need to look at other areas of life because if we're working on something like black and white thinking, you're not going to be able to change black and white thinking only in one area of your life, just with the food. And then everything else you can just be black and white about because the brain's not going to make that shift. So it's often about becoming more nuanced everywhere. So it is a very holistic, like what's going on in your whole life approach. Finding a sense of purpose, which doesn't have to be big purpose, but just a sense of things that matter to you, things that mean something to you, what your values are. So exactly that whole when you have a problem with body image or food, it can feel like that is all you think about. And people think, well, I want to fix this eating disorder so I can then go and live my life and engage with life. And sometimes it's the other way around. It's need to go out there, start engaging with life in order to be able to start healing the eating disorder.
Yeah, I really love that you mentioned the concept of meaning. I really believe in logotherapy and the work of Viktor Frankl, and I even wrote a book about it that it will be published soon. Uh, he said once that he who has a way to live can bear with almost anyhow. I believe it was he quote Nietzsche on saying that. Yeah, I believe that maybe I can't deal with food right now because I can't I can't tolerate the pain of food of treating my food disorder. But if I have meaning in other areas in my life, this will help me to tolerate the pain of recovery from my eating disorder. So I believe, yeah, many of our problems get solved by not focusing on them and healing other areas in our life.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. And that work for me is really fun work to do because it's focusing on what you want, not what you don't want. I sometimes talk about recovery as a creative process because it can feel like you're giving something up, you're losing something, because there can be times when the binging can bring relief. So rather than thinking about it, I'm trying to stop the binging, it's like actually maybe we're trying to create something that is less compatible with the binging, as opposed to I have to stop this first and then do the thing, because there's a gap there that's just going to keep getting filled up with the food thoughts and the body image stuff because there's nothing to replace it.
Mhm. Okay, let's move into a very important topic because I believe it's a crucial thing to talk about. What is intuitive eating and how can someone learn it?
Hmm. Well, intuitive eating is a framework for what a healthy relationship with food and body can look like. And there are 10 principles to intuitive eating. And it's one of those things that is seems to be simple and complicated at the same time. It's often the two biggest misunderstandings is people think that intuitive eating is either eating whatever you want, no boundaries, no nothing, just whatever you want. Or the other thinking is it's eat when you're hungry and stop when you're full. The parts of intuitive eating that don't even often get talked about is things like manage your emotions with kindness.
Mhm.
So anytime you are practicing self-compassion, that's part of the intuitive eating framework. But people sometimes turn intuitive eating itself into like a program to follow, and it becomes another thing that they're on the wagon or off the wagon. So it's things like an intuitive eating. It's about rejecting the diet mentality, so making a commitment not to diet. It's getting rid of food morality and seeing foods as good or bad. It's giving yourself permission to eat foods that you want to eat, but also to experiment with and find out how certain foods make you feel. It's honoring your hunger, which sometimes people think means you have to wait until you're hungry. But often what they're saying is don't allow yourself to get too hungry because that can be a trigger for a binge. And I think it's one of the biggest mistakes is people who struggle with binge eating. They go, I'm going to try and eat when I'm hungry and stop when I'm full. Because a lot of the time, if you wait until you are hungry and your appetite signals are all over the place, because you've waited until you're hungry, your brain is already perceiving it as too late. And then you end up eating, not feeling satisfied because you might feel physically full, but your brain's going, we want more food. So quite often the regular eating, people seem to think isn't compatible with intuitive eating, but it absolutely is. Having a substantial breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and maybe including some snacks too. Another part of intuitive eating is about respecting your body. So that's all the body image work. Again, all comes under intuitive eating. Joyful movement, finding a way to move your body that feels good, because we know that movement benefits us in so many ways. And I appreciate it's not accessible to everybody as well. And then the last principle is about gentle nutrition. So it's not that you don't pay any attention whatsoever to nutrition, but it is the last principle because it's like there's psychological and emotional work to be done for some people before they can even think about nutrition. Whereas for others, it's not quite as triggering. Some people just thinking about nutrition throws them straight back into the rules. For me, it was kind of okay. I did include some gentle nutrition in my intuitive eating quite early on. And because obviously I'm not a nutritionist, so I'm not going into any great depth with my clients. We're simply looking at things like increasing fiber, so fibrous foods, because that's going to help with balancing blood sugar, with satiety, things like that. We're not talking about cutting anything out. And then with meals, it's like trying to figure out what foods are satisfying to you. So as we know, one of the most satisfying combinations is your protein, fats, carbohydrates, and fiber. That doesn't have to be a rule for every meal, but ideally we do want to be doing that quite often because it's going to make us feel more satisfied. So that's kind of it in a bit of a summary. There is the intuitive eating book, which is called Intuitive Eating by Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch.
Mhm.
And that's available, obviously, wherever you get your books from. And it's probably the best place to go to because a lot of people go to social media to get their information on intuitive eating. And that's why so many people think they know what it is. But I also think it's quite nice, even going into the podcast platforms and searching for Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch and listen to interviews with them. Because to be honest, the intuitive eating book itself, a lot of people seem to give up on it because it is a bit dense. It's not the easiest read. So I think sometimes if you just listen to, especially Evelyn Tribole, she talks about it quite well. When they go on podcasts, they might talk to a guest for 2 hours and they tell you all about it and you hear it properly without having to necessarily trawl through a book because not so many people are sitting down and reading the books these days.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, when I discovered intuitive eating, it was kind of a paradigm shift for me. Uh, it changed my whole approach to
Wow.
diets and weight loss, and yeah, I really love the 10 principles of intuitive eating, but I'm still working on understanding them more because
Hmm.
I'm getting more training in this approach. But I have some questions that I want to learn from you. If you,
Mm.
I feel that many people are afraid of trying this approach because when I tell them that there are no forbidden foods,
Hmm.
okay, they start to think that okay, I can eat right now. I can eat chocolate. I can eat these highly processed foods. Uh, and here lies the problem. I believe that these foods are not natural. Uh, um, they are designed in a certain way to be addictive. We don't find in nature these mixtures of fat and carbs and in certain percentages. So how can someone apply intuitive eating with such food criteria, uh, given that they are addictive in nature?
Hmm. I think sometimes it sounds like just throw the doors open and just, let everything in. And for some people, that works brilliantly. There's the all in approach, especially for people with a more restrictive background. This seems to work better. Not necessarily, but those tend to be the people that seem to benefit the most from just going all in by going, no rules. I can have whatever I want whenever I want. That wouldn't have worked for me. And for a lot of people, I think feel a bit gaslighted by that approach because it's not working for them. So I tend to think, or I tend to work with people like, first of all, what is going on around these foods when you're eating these foods? Because the majority of people, certainly people that I work with, when they're eating these kinds of foods, they're also looking at a screen most of the time. They're doing something else. So the whole goal of intuitive eating is to develop interoceptive awareness, which is the capacity to be more internally regulated around food. So that is coming from being able to read your own body signals, to be very in touch with that and connected with that. We cannot learn interoceptive awareness if we are completely checking out when we're eating these foods. Now, I'm not saying you have to go to some kind of perfect mindfulness place where you sit down and you lay out a pretty napkin and there's no distractions. You have a candle and you just eat as slowly as you possibly can, because that's just like all or nothing thinking.
Mhm.
So, really, sometimes I work with clients and I say, okay, how can we be 20% more present when you're eating? What does 20% more presence look like? It could be taking something out of a packet and arranging it on a plate, because there's something about the visuals of that, and like you are signaling to the brain that food is coming as well. When we see food disappearing, that has an impact on our satiety compared to when we can't see what's happening. We're just putting our hands into the bag. It might be that you have the first couple of bites mindfully, and then then you switch to something else. It could be that you listen to something like a podcast or something rather than watching something, so that you are looking at the food and seeing the food disappear. Because, when you mentioned addiction earlier, what I think can be very addictive is food and screens. There's something about the state, right? It lulls you into a kind of state, which is very much how people use addictive substances, to create that kind of the soothing or the numbness or the checking out or whatever it looks like. Again, for some people, this is not everyone's experience when they're eating in front of a screen. So we need to bring more attention to food. And when people do that, they often notice all their judgments coming out. Well, the first principles of intuitive eating, before you even get to the permission, is dismantling the diet culture, dismantling the moralization of foods. Because most people who I've spoken to who try mindful eating, the reason why they're trying mindful eating is to try to eat less. So the minute they want more than they think that they should, the mindful eating goes out the window and they just kind of toss it aside because they don't want to stay mindful and eat more than they think they should. It feels impossible because they're so conflicted. There's so much emotion around that. So I think there is something about presence that needs to be in there as well, and being in the body and being connected to that. I think sometimes with permission as well, for some people, it's like, there are certain foods, it's like, I just can't have it in the house. So I'm not going to say, yeah, bring all those foods in. Sometimes we do it gradually. For a lot of people, there's a scale of foods that they feel really out of control on. Every time they have them around, they just eat them all. Foods that they may be a little bit more of a grey area, that maybe they sometimes feel like they overeat on a bit, but not quite as much. Those might be the foods to bring in first to try to normalize. The other thing I do around permission is getting people to plan in these foods. Because the other problem is people will only eat these foods when they're really craving them. So they wait till they have a big craving. So then there's the craving, they eat the food, and not only does the food taste good, but there's the release of tension of the craving. So now this food keeps become associated with like tension release. Ideally, we want to be able to experience having some chocolate or having one of these foods when we could take it or leave it, because then we have a different emotional experience of the food. But as a compulsive eater, you'll go like, oh no, if I could take it or leave it, I should always be leaving it. So these, I guess, are some of the ways that I work with permission, which is why I sometimes say intuitive eating can be very simple, but actually it can be quite complex when you're trying to figure out how to apply it in your life and work through some of these really deep-rooted, long-established patterns with food.
Okay. So, as a nutritionist, I want everyone to eat the healthiest food options out there. How to convince someone that these foods are delicious and that they should get used to eating them without entering this restrictive mindset that we talked about earlier, the diet mindset. It's not diet, okay? I tell them it's not a diet, but healthy food is good for your body. It's delicious. It makes you feel comfortable. How to do this trick?
One, you're not going to convince them. Also, I would just mention that some people, especially people who may have been raised as children on more processed foods, can actually find the kinds of foods you're talking about not that satisfying. They're delicious to you, not necessarily to someone else.
Okay, they must enter into kind of detox first.
Well, not even necessarily, because they might go through, let's say they went sugar-free and they have the headaches and this, that, and the other, and then they're eating the healthy food. It might still, their preference might be so wired in for these other foods because that's what they were raised on. Like that's what their brain and body is used to. And the problem is because they've had that pressure on what they should or shouldn't be eating, they're going to resist that from you as well, because that's going to feel like all the other judgmental messages they've had, no matter how well-intentioned and non-judgmental you are, that's not going to be how it feels. It feels like another should, another thing that they're getting wrong. So I have worked with people before who are like, don't like a lot of fruits and vegetables. So we start with, okay, well, what are the ones that you do like? And can we add some of that in? And sometimes some people have done it even kind of seeing it a little bit like medicine. So it's like, I'm going to have my usual breakfast or whatever I have. But do you know what? I don't mind bananas. So I'm going to have a banana each morning with my breakfast. So I think, again, it's like when you look at where they were, because you'll have this idea like the kind of foods you like to eat and what a healthy diet looks like. But it's relative to what they've been brought up on, introducing a little bit of fruit. That might be quite a big thing for them. But this
Mhm.
idea that everybody's taste buds are going to adapt and then find those the most desirable, from what I've seen, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. I think quite a few people can, because quite a few people can get like in a habit or a pattern of like the taste, right, of these foods has been designed to really hit our bliss points. So it can be, I sometimes find if I go away, I go for a weekend or I'm staying somewhere and I end up eating more processed foods than usual. I sometimes find that again, like, I don't really like this language, but just for ease, I'll use it like the healthier foods, the more whole foods, sometimes don't taste as good for a bit.
Mhm.
But I stick with it because I know that they will. So I might plan a few meals that just have more vegetables in, and then I'll have them. And after a couple of days, I can feel myself kind of shift. And I think this is what you're describing, and some people experience it, but from what I'm seeing, some people don't.
Yeah, I can only speak about my own experience. I used to be overweight, and I struggled with like drinking soda like water. I used to drink a huge amount of soda every day, and sugar and all of that. But what really helped me was going to the gym. Uh, Firstly, I didn't want to lose weight. I just wanted to build some muscle mass. But following the diet and the rules of the gym, that you must eat high protein diet, yeah, don't eat a lot of carbohydrates and all of that. It gradually changed my taste buds, and I started liking the foods that are high in protein, low in carb. So I believe it happens over even years. It can take years. Um, and people finally reach their own conclusion that, yeah, healthy food is better for me. I feel better when I eat these kinds of foods. I can't hear you.
I guess people have to want to. And that's the important thing. I think there's this hope that you can convince them. I think you can share your experience, I think is one of the best ways. So to just say, this was my experience. It used to be like this, and I went through this. So I'm wondering whether you think something similar could be possible for you. Do you see what I mean? That's so much less like, this is my experience. I'm wondering if it could be similar for you, as opposed to, as a nutritionist, this is what I think is best for you to do, which again is coming from like a good place, but it's going to be received very differently. I think through sharing our own experiences, we are able to get certain messages out there. But people have to really feel willing, because if they're battling with themselves about doing that, it's not going to be possible for them. It's going to feel like something again that they keep failing at. And the amount of people I've worked with who tell me they just lied to nutritionists. And that's what will happen if they feel the pressure. They won't be
Mhm.
100% truthful with you, because the shame will stop that. It's not personal, but it's just their shame is being triggered by that.
Okay, we are running out of time here, so I want to ask one last question. Uh, I want to hear more about yeah, your own treatment approach. If you can tell us how you deal with a typical case, what is the Ralic method that you mentioned in your book? How it helps people? Yeah, I want to hear more from you about
Yeah,
your own methods.
yeah, yeah. I think one of the biggest blocks for anybody to make positive change is shame. And so many people use shame, they try to use it as a motivator to change their behavior, and it just doesn't work. It can work for a bit, maybe make them comply with some rules for a bit, but at some point, it switches back. So I'm a big fan of group work, because when people are in groups together, they they're in places where they feel understood, where they don't feel judged, because they feel like everybody there gets it. And the relief that people experience, a lot of people talk about, it's almost like a very physical feeling of relief of, I'm not the only one. But I think people can get that feeling from listening to stories of people who've gone through it as well. So don't underestimate how shame can hold you back. And then if I think about it with binging or compulsive eating, there's two, broadly speaking, like main things going on. One is the reaction to restriction, and the other is some kind of emotional reaction, or we might think of it as they're using food as a way to try and regulate, maybe regulate their mood, regulate their nervous system, whatever that might be, regulate their emotions. And so the problem is if someone has a binge or a compulsive eating episode, it's almost impossible to know how much of that was triggered by a scarcity mindset, restricting, planning to restrict, and how much of it was emotional. So I always start with the restriction part first, looking at where that is showing up. Because some people will think, I thought for me that restriction didn't apply to me because I wasn't really restricting. I wasn't losing weight. I wasn't dieting, but I was trying to. Every day I was promising myself I was going to do it differently. I didn't realize for the longest time how just me trying to constantly planning to restrict was part of what was triggering my binges. So someone might not be restricting, but if they're feeling guilty every time they're eating, I work with people who say they feel guilty every time they eat. They feel like they shouldn't eat, that they don't need food, that they've got enough on their body, they shouldn't be eating. That's a restrictive mindset. So we have to kind of work a bit on that piece first, because until that part has settled down, then we can see what's left. Because some people, you work on the restriction and the binging calms down enough. The emotions weren't that much of a factor. Everybody eats a bit emotionally sometimes, but it wasn't like creating these binges or whatever. So we do that bit first, and then we look at the emotional side of it. But the Ralick method is basically about recognizing what's going on in this moment. Because ultimately, it's more for people who are using food to escape. If we are using food, we feel that compulsion. We're having a compulsion to escape this moment. It's because we're resisting something about this moment. And often that's unconscious. It can be a vague, itchy feeling. It doesn't even have to be a concrete thing. And that can be enough to make us want to leave. So the Ralick method is really about recognizing like what's actually going on around us. It's centering ourselves where we are. It's recognizing there's a method of going through and naming what we're feeling and then naming what we're believing. Because it's not necessarily our thoughts that are having the biggest effect, but it's our beliefs. The difference I mean is we can be believing something in a moment that's not running through the front of our mind like a thought. So we wouldn't even recognize it was there unless we stopped to actually look to see what we might be believing. And then we go through and we sort of accept what's actually going on. We accept the situation, we accept the emotions one by one, we accept the beliefs one by one. Because when you're just looking at one piece of your experience, it's normally like, okay, I can allow this to be, and this is why. And then the idea is if we can accept this moment, the compulsion to escape it reduces. Mm-hmm. So very influenced by Eckhart Tolle and his power of now work, this idea that, being able to be here in the moment, we don't usually have a problem. Our problems are in the story of our life, what's happened before, what's going to happen, and what we're believing about our circumstances, what we're believing about ourselves. So that would be another piece as well of how it works. But there's the restriction bit and then there's the existential bit, which is what does it mean to be who I am on this planet, living this life, what matters to me, trying to make sense of emotional experience. Because if you didn't have good modeling in terms of how to manage your emotions, food works. It works really well because when we eat, a lot of the times we do feel calmer. It can soothe the body. It can calm the nervous system. So we're likely to turn to it. So it's not as straightforward as, oh, I do this step, this step, this step, this step. But that's kind of a bit of an overview of how I think about the work and what I've seen and what I believe actually can work for a lot of people.
Great. Sarah, thank you very much for your time. This episode will be translated into Arabic, so the Arabic-speaking world might know more about you and your work. One final thought, how can someone find more about you? If you can speak the English, I'm also will work on translating more videos from your channel. But if someone can speak English, how can we find more about you?
Yeah, well, you can go to my YouTube channel, which is the Binge Eating Therapist, because I have loads of videos there if you want to find out more about my method. But I mean, I have a website, thebingeeatingtherapist.com. I run binge eating therapy groups where people can join anywhere in the world and connect with other people who are struggling with binge eating. I run support groups as well. So you can see all of that stuff on my website, which I'm sure you can pop the details in the description or something and find me there.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for your time. It was
You're
a
very
pleasure
welcome.
to have you.
Thanks for having me.